The desert sun burned mercilessly, turning the sand into shimmering waves of heat. There, beneath the lonely silhouette of a twisted mesquite tree, a young girl stood trembling. Her wrists were bound with a heavy iron chain that clung to the tree's trunk, its metal biting into her delicate skin. She couldn't have been more than 12, her small frame fragile against the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. The wind whipped her hair into her tear-streaked face, and the silence of the desert was broken only by her sobs. Beside the mansion on the hill, far away, a white horse pawed the ground restlessly. He had seen what no one else dared to witness. His dark eyes had followed the cruel man dragging the child out into the barren land. He had heard the clinking of chains, the girl's cries, the merciless command, "Stay here. Learn your lesson." The world might have turned its back on her, but not the horse. What the millionaire did not know was that his cruelty would not remain hidden. For in the silent loyalty of a white horse, justice was stirring. The town of Clearwater sat at the edge of the Mojave Desert, a place where the days were unbearably hot, and the nights were filled with silence thick enough to choke. At its heart, dominating the horizon, was a sprawling estate built from pale stone and glass. It belonged to Edward Holloway, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. Edward had made his fortune in land speculation, buying up water rights, mines, and ranches until half the county bent to his will. People whispered about him in town, how his money could buy anything, anyone. And yet, for all his riches, there was one thing he could never command: love. Inside that mansion lived his daughter, Clara, a girl of 12. She had hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes like the pale blue morning sky. Clara was delicate, but not weak. She carried within her a spirit that refused to be crushed. Still, she lived in constant fear of her father's temper. He was a man who demanded obedience, who saw compassion as weakness, and who considered children little more than clay to be molded by force. The only comfort Clara knew came from the stables at the far end of the estate. There, among the scent of hay and the rustle of straw, lived a white stallion named Solace. The horse was unlike any other. His coat gleamed like snow under sunlight, and his mane flowed like silk in the desert wind. He was intelligent, almost too intelligent for an animal, and he seemed to understand Clara's every word, every touch. When the weight of her father's cold silence crushed her, Clara would slip away to the stable, pressing her cheek against Solace's warm neck. She whispered her secrets into his ear, the ones she dared not speak to anyone else. "You're the only one who sees me," she would murmur, and Solace would nuzzle her shoulder, as if in answer. Despite the grandeur of her home, Clara's days were marked by loneliness. Servants walked the halls in silence, forbidden to speak freely in Edward's presence. At dinner, she sat across from her father at a table long enough to seat 20, but only the sound of clinking silverware ever filled the room. He rarely looked at her, and when he did, it was with cold calculation. To the outside world, Edward Holloway presented himself as a man of principle, a pillar of success. He donated to charities, shook hands with politicians, and rode into town in his polished black carriage. But behind closed doors, his heart was a fortress of stone. He viewed his daughter not as a soul to nurture, but as an heir to discipline and to obedience. The breaking point came one sweltering summer afternoon. Clara, restless and yearning for freedom, had slipped out to the desert edge where the wildflowers grew after a rare rain. She returned hours later, her cheeks flushed, her shoes covered in dust. Edward had been waiting, anger simmering in his eyes. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I was just walking," Clara whispered. "I wanted to see the flowers." "Defiance," he spat. "You think you can disobey me without consequence? You live in my house. You breathe because I allow it. And yet you dare run wild like some common stray." Clara tried to speak, but fear stole her words. In that moment, she realized how little mercy her father possessed. His pride was fragile, and he saw her independence as an insult. That night, as Clara curled up in bed, Solace stirred in his stall. The horse lifted his head toward the mansion, as though sensing the storm brewing inside. He pawed the ground, restless, his ears twitching toward the faint echo of raised voices drifting through the open windows. For Clara, the world had always been divided, cruelty inside those cold stone walls, and comfort in the stables beside her loyal companion. She clung to solace as a child clings to hope, never suspecting that soon her father's wrath would reach a darkness she could scarcely imagine. Because Edward Holloway was a man who believed punishment must be severe enough to scar, and he was about to choose a punishment so cruel, so unthinkable, that even the desert itself would bear witness. And Solace, the white horse, would not forget. Dawn bled slowly over the desert, a thin pale line above the black teeth of the distant hills. The mansion breathed in silence. Servants moved like ghosts along the corridor, eyes cast down, because they had learned that sometimes silence kept a person safe. Clara stood at the top of the stairs in a simple cotton dress, her hair braided poorly in her own rush, because Edward Holloway did not like to be kept waiting. He was waiting by the porte-cochere, gloved hands folded behind his back, a canvas-walled buckboard already hitched. A burlap sack lay beneath the bench seat, heavy enough to dent the wooden floorboards. Clara noticed the weight of it. She also noticed, with a child-sharpened attention, that he had not asked the stable hands to ready Solace. He had chosen a wagon, and he had chosen not to bring her horse. "Get in," he said. His voice was measured, almost pleasant. That, more than anything, frightened her. Edward was not a man of warmth, but when he concealed his anger, it meant the anger had hardened into decision. She hesitated. The housekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Hanley, stepped into the doorway as if to speak, then felt Edward's eyes and retreated. Clara climbed onto the bench. The leather creaked. The sun was not yet hot, but the heat to come already stirred in the air like something alive. They rode without conversation. The gravel road unspooled behind them, the estate shrank, then vanished behind a swell of pale rock. The wagon rattled past creosote and low sage, past spines of cholla throwing long, cruel shadows. Edward kept the team at a steady pace. He drove like he signed contracts, precise, unhurried, leaving no room for accident. "Where are we going?" Clara finally asked. "To learn a lesson," he said. "I'm sorry about yesterday," she whispered. "I didn't mean." "Meaning is for poets." He did not look at her. "Order does not ask what you mean. It asks what you do." Clara pressed her fingers together in her lap and tried to quiet the tremor. She had known punishments, long hours standing in the corner of his study, copying lines until her hand cramped, meals sent away untouched because she had spoken out of turn. She had known his talent for turning love into a test, then declaring she had failed. But the burlap sack, the untraveled direction, the hour, they gnawed at her. From the far paddocks, where the earth sloped gently behind the stable, a white head lifted above the rails. Solace watched the buckboard crest the ridge and diminish into the morning. He stood very still, as horses do when they listen. The breeze carried no words, only the faint squeal of a wheel and the rattle of something heavy under canvas. His ears pricked forward, then back. He pawed once at the dirt, then, after a time, settled, waiting in his quiet, patient way, the way of an animal that measures time by the sun and the return of footfalls it loves. The buckboard left the main road and struck east into country few visited. There was a stand of mesquite there, gnarled and stubborn, roots sunk into soil where nearly nothing else bothered to try. Edward halted by one of the older trees, its trunk twisted into the shape of a question mark, its shade small as a hand. He set the brake and climbed down. "Come," he said. Clara did not move. Her legs would not answer. Edward reached up, lifted her under the arms as if she were a parcel, set her on the ground, and turned to the burlap sack. He dragged it to the tail and knelt. The knot released beneath his thumb, and the mouth gaped open. Inside lay a coil of chain. Not rope. Not leather. Iron, thick as a man's little finger, each link stamped with tiny letters, E.H. and Company, the mark of the foundry he owned on the far side of town. Pride, in him, stamped itself even into the tools he used to punish. Clara's breath shorted. She took a step back. The desert gave her nowhere to go. "Hold out your wrists," Edward said. "Papa, please. This will end sooner if you do not waste both our time." She did what terror commanded, she obeyed. He looped a short length of leather around each wrist first, oddly careful, like a man keeping a suit from ash as he steps through a fire. He slid the iron through the leather cuffs, so the metal would bite less, whether from mercy or to keep the skin from tearing too quickly. With Edward, even kindness served a calculation. He moved with a craftsman's economy. One end of the chain around the trunk, twice, a padlock the size of his palm, its key turning with a final little click that sounded to her like the end of something. He left perhaps 6 feet of slack. Enough to sit. Enough to stand and turn and feel the edge of shade and sun. Not enough to run. "You will remain here," he said. "You will not wander. You will not scream. The desert does not listen, and neither do I." She could not reconcile the body she had known as a house, the man who had carried her once when she was small and feverish, who had set her in the crook of his arm to sign papers as a joke in front of his friends, with this man aligning links of iron so that his daughter could learn silence. Children are stubborn accountants, they count every moment of tenderness forever. Even now, she looked for it somewhere in his face, some tiny sign that this would stop. He reached into the wagon again and took out a canteen. He waited, then set it on the ground just within the circle she could reach. "1 tin for the day. None for night. I will return after dark. If you have found stillness by then, we will go home." The lie sat in the air between them like a humming fly. He had not brought a blanket. He had not brought food. He had not brought the stable hand or a witness who might quietly peel this scene from whatever conscience slept in him. He had brought chain he owned and a lock only he had the key for, and he had chosen a tree in a pocket of land he controlled with a signature. He had built systems his entire life, of water, of law, of debt. Today, he had folded his daughter into one. "Why?" she asked. The word sounded so small that for a second he frowned, as if he had heard it from far away. "Because the world breaks those who do not bend," he said. "I would rather be the one to bend you." He stepped back, studied the lock, and nodded once. Then, with that lightness cruelty sometimes wears, because cruelty believes itself neat, he climbed into the wagon. He released the brake, snapped the reins, and wheeled the team in a half-circle. "Papa." The word tore her throat. He did not look. The wagon rattled away. He drove 100 yards, then turned off the old track and took a cleaner line south, where the ground, hard-packed by flash floods, would hold fewer prints. After another mile, he stopped, unlashed a wide branch he had tied under the buckboard, and dragged it behind the wheels for a stretch, sweeping what marks remained. The desert never truly keeps secrets, but Edward had learned to make it take a while to speak. The sound of the wagon thinned, then died. Clara stood very still, as if the air itself might startle if she moved. The chain lay like a sleeping serpent across her feet. The mesquite's small circle of shade shifted with the inching sun, and she learned quickly to keep it on her face. The desert lifted its voice, a cicada buzz, a hawk's far call, the faint shiver of sand against bark. She touched the canteen. Warm water sloshed inside. She put it down and folded her hands because part of her still believed that obedience might move some hidden lever in him. Time loosened, went slack. Ants discovered her boots and walked the ridge of leather like soldiers on a parapet. The iron warmed and then burned until the leather cuffs beneath felt like a blessing. At noon, light crashed straight down, the chain, now hot as a stove handle, shone white. She drank only when she began to see distance ripple, when the ground rolled gently as if breathing. The water tasted of tin and the sour of old wells. She forced herself to stop at a mouthful because the canteen felt lighter already. She whispered to herself, the child's arithmetic of imagined rescue. "He will come," he said night. "He will come when I am quiet. I am quiet now. See? I am quiet." She pressed her lips together, shook, and swallowed the cry. A dust devil stitched itself together on the flats and leaned toward her, a moving column of grit. It passed 20 feet away, uncurling like smoke. Clara shut her eyes. Tears salted her mouth. She thought of the stable when the sun slid behind the roof line and the air cooled at last. She thought of Solace's breath, warm and grassy, puffing against her collarbone. She heard, in memory, the small sound he made sometimes, not a whicker, not a snort, more like a question. An hour later, in the paddock, Solace set his nose against the latch. The stable boy had not double-bolted it. Habit, laziness, or grace, no one would know which later. The iron pin stuck, then gave. Solace leaned sideways with the brute patience horses possess, tested, found the angle, and the gate whispered open. He stepped through onto the service road, dropped his head to smell the track where the wagon's wheels had scabbed the dust at daybreak, and stood there a long moment, thinking the way a horse thinks, by scent, by pressure, by the habit of footfall and return. He did not run. He moved into a careful trot, then a ground-eating lope, conserving himself because the day would be long. His shadow knifed ahead of him across the pale road. By mid-afternoon, Clara's thoughts began to break like thin ice. She counted everything because counting kept the panic from rushing the room. 10 breaths. 10 more. 100 heartbeats. She counted the cracks in the bark where the chain pressed. She sang under her breath, soundless, shaping the words only with her mouth. The lullaby the cook had once hummed in the scullery. The silly tune she whispered into Solace's ear on evenings when the world felt like a weight. If you're brave, then I am brave. If you stay, then I can stay. Near sunset, a shadow crossed her face. She opened her eyes and for a happy instant believed it was her father returning earlier than promised. It was a hawk taking the tree's small shade, the sudden hush of wings. The canteen was nearly empty now. She tipped it and caught a final lukewarm mouthful. The light softened, gilded the edges of the mesquite leaves, heat lifted, leaving behind a different danger. Night in the desert arrives like a trapdoor. Warmth vanishes. Wind finds every seam. The iron remained hot for a while, then turned cruelly cold. Edward Holloway reached the mansion just as the western sky caught fire. He drove into the carriage house and set the brake with the same tidy motion with which he had locked the padlock. He told no one where he'd been. He washed his hands. For dinner he took soup and a chop and a glass of a Bordeaux too expensive to forget its own name. In the study afterward, he sat beneath a portrait of himself and made notes in a small ledger on the corner of the desk, adjustments to a deed transfer, a line about a supplier who needed disciplining, a last neat entry, see, Discipline Day 1. On the hill behind the stables, the white horse moved through falling light, alone, nose low, following a line only he could read. He did not hurry. He did not doubt. The desert took note of him the way it takes note of a storm before it sees the clouds, a pressure, a gathering. Under the mesquite, Clara curled her knees to her chest and tried to keep her teeth from knocking. The stars came hard and sharp, like nails punched into black wood. She pressed her cheek to the bark, to the smell of sap and dust, and she whispered into the dark, voice a thread. Solace, if you're brave then I am brave, if you stay then I can stay. Over the rise, out of sight, a white shape moved against the gathering night, quiet, relentless, reading what the cruel had tried to erase. The desert night was a strange companion, silent yet alive, vast yet suffocating. Every sound seemed magnified, the chirr of insects, the whisper of wind combing over the dunes, the distant cry of a coyote. Beneath the mesquite tree, Clara shivered violently. The day's cruel heat had drained her strength, and the night's bitter chill now robbed her of comfort. She huddled against the trunk, clutching her knees, the chain clinking whenever she shifted. The stars above blazed mercilessly, countless and sharp. They offered no warmth, only the reminder of how small she was in a world so endless. Every few minutes, Clara's head jerked upward at phantom sounds. Was it footsteps? Was her father returning? But the desert swallowed her cries, and no one came. No one, except the one who had always come. Far from the tree, a steady rhythm rose against the hush of night. Hoofbeats, muffled but sure, pressed into the sand. The pale shape of Solace moved across the desert like a ghost summoned by love. His mane caught the moonlight, rippling like silver. His nostrils flared as he followed the faint thread of Clara's scent, mixed with the wagon's track and the tang of iron that clung to the chain. Solace was no supernatural creature. He did not fly, nor speak in human tongue. But loyalty is its own kind of miracle, and it was loyalty that carried him over miles of wasteland with tireless steps. He remembered Clara's hands on his neck, her voice whispering secrets only he had ever been trusted to hear. He remembered the panic in her eyes that morning when the wagon rattled away. And so he went, guided by instinct, guided by bond. By midnight, Clara was drifting into fevered dreams. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. She thought she heard her lullaby again, faint and low, as if the desert itself sang back to her words. Her eyes fluttered open, and there, in the wavering moonlight, stood Solace. The girl gasped. At first she thought she was dreaming. But then the horse stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his hooves pressing soft circles into the dust. His head lowered, and he let out a low nicker that vibrated through her bones like comfort itself. Solace, she whispered, voice breaking. The horse pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. She reached out with trembling fingers, touched his mane, and sobbed into his neck. He smelled of hay and earth and home. For a moment, the terror of chains and shadows receded. But Solace was not only there for comfort. He pulled back, circled around the mesquite, and sniffed at the chain. His teeth worked at the iron, his hooves pawed the lock. Sparks of instinct told him this was wrong, that the child was trapped. He strained, but iron was stronger than teeth. The padlock held. He snorted, frustrated, ears flicking back. Clara stroked his cheek. It's no use, she murmured. He locked it. Only he can. Yet Solace did not leave. Instead, he backed away a few steps, lifted his head, and let out a piercing neigh that split the silence of the desert. It was not the sound of fear, it was a call, sharp and insistent, meant to travel far. The cry echoed into the distance, bouncing against stone and sand. Somewhere, coyotes paused. Somewhere, the night stirred. He cried out again, then settled beside her, folding his legs beneath him, lowering his body to the earth so she could lean against his warmth. For the first time since the wagon had gone, Clara slept, not well, not safely, but with hope pressed close to her. By dawn, Solace was pacing restlessly. The desert sun would soon return with its cruel fire, and Clara's canteen was nearly empty. He knew, whether by instinct or memory, that time was running out. The girl's breaths came shallow, her lips pale, her body trembling even as sweat dampened her brow. So the horse acted. He rose, nuzzled her once as if to say wait, then turned and began to move. He did not gallop blindly into the sands. He traced the wagon's trail back toward town, hooves drumming with urgency. On the road into Clearwater, a pair of ranch hands were driving cattle toward the stockyard. They were the first to see him. Hey, one shouted, pulling his horse to a stop. Ain't that Holloway's stallion? The white horse barreled toward them, sides lathered, eyes burning with something that made both men stiffen. He circled them, then stopped, stamping his hoof into the dirt, hard and fast. Again and again. Then he wheeled and trotted a few steps back the way he had come, before turning and looking at them expectantly. The ranch hands exchanged glances. That ain't normal, one muttered. No, the other agreed, narrowing his eyes. He wants us to follow. And follow they did. Solace led them out of town, down the old wagon track Edward had tried to conceal. The sun was climbing higher, the heat sharpening. Sweat beaded the men's brows as they spurred their horses after him. The stallion did not slow, did not falter, until at last he crested the ridge and descended toward the mesquite. There, they saw her. The girl slumped against the tree, wrists bound in iron, skin pale, lips cracked. She stirred faintly at the sound of hooves, lifting her head in disbelief. God Almighty, one ranch hand breathed, leaping from his saddle. They rushed to her side, tugging at the chain, examining the lock. The sight of bruised wrists and sunburned cheeks ignited something in them, fury, pity, urgency. Who did this? One asked, though deep down they already knew. Clara tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, Papa. The men stiffened. No explanation was needed. In Clearwater, everyone whispered about Edward Holloway's coldness. But none had imagined this. We need a blacksmith for this lock, one said quickly. And a doctor. Ride fast. I'll stay with her. The other mounted and tore off toward town, dust rising in his wake. Salas pressed against Clara's side, breathing steady and strong. She clung to his mane weakly, eyes flooding with tears. You found me, she whispered. The horse nickered low, as if answering. By late afternoon, word had spread like wildfire. The sheriff himself rode out with a blacksmith in tow, along with a wagon carrying blankets, water, and a doctor. When they reached the mesquite tree, they found Clara barely conscious, her wrists raw but her spirit flickering stubbornly. The blacksmith worked the lock, sparks flying as iron rang against iron. At last, with a final groan of protest, the shackle gave way. The chain slithered into the sand. Clara's small body sagged forward into the arms of the doctor. The sheriff's gaze hardened. He looked at the men who had found her, at the white stallion standing close, and then at the horizon where the mansion lay hidden. Edward Holloway's gone too far, he said. And as the wagon carrying Clara back to town creaked forward, Salas walked beside it, head held high, mane flowing in the late sun. He had not spoken a word, but his actions had shouted louder than any testimony. The town would soon know what the desert had witnessed. And Edward Holloway would learn that the chain he placed upon his daughter had become the very chain dragging him toward justice. Clearwater was a town that kept its head down. Men tipped their hats to Edward Holloway because his name signed their wages, and women lowered their eyes when his carriage rolled through the square. His wealth was like a shadow, long and inescapable. For years, people had whispered about his cruelty, but whispers never broke chains. That changed the moment Clara was carried back into town. The doctor's office door swung open, and townsfolk crowded the porch, craning to see. Clara lay weak but alive on a cot, her small hands wrapped in linen, her lips parched. She whispered only a few words, the tree, the chain, Papa. Those words rippled through the gathered crowd like sparks on dry grass. But it was not just her words that moved them, it was the sight of Salas, the white horse, standing guard at the entrance. His coat glowed in the dusk, mane tousled by the desert wind, eyes sharp and watchful. He had followed the wagon all the way, refusing to leave Clara's side. People saw in him something undeniable, a witness who could not lie, a creature too pure to be twisted by money. Sheriff Dawson stood on the boardwalk, hat in his hands, jaw clenched. He had tolerated Edward's arrogance for years, telling himself that law and wealth must find a balance. But the sight of that child's bruised wrists shattered the illusion. He turned to his deputy. "Fetch Holloway," Dawson said, voice like flint striking steel. "Bring him here. Tonight." Edward arrived at twilight, still wearing the polished black suit he had dined in. He entered the doctor's office with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The crowd outside muttered, restless, a low thunder. "My daughter," Edward said, feigning outrage. "What has happened here?" "Who dares?" "She dares," the sheriff cut him off, nodding toward Clara. "And so does that horse." Edward's face stiffened. His eyes flicked to Salas, who stood just beyond the open doorway, ears pricked forward, as if listening. "This is absurd," Edward scoffed. "You take the word of a sickly child and an animal over mine?" But Clara stirred on the cot, her voice faint but clear. "He chained me. In the desert." Salas saw everything. Gasps rippled through the room. Edward's mask cracked for the briefest second. "Lies," he barked. "She disobeyed me and wandered off. I sent the horse after her. That is all." But Salas moved then. As if summoned by truth itself, the stallion stepped forward into the lamplight. His hooves clacked against the wooden floorboards. The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the white horse. Salas circled once, then stopped in front of Edward. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and sniffed at the man's gloves. Then he let out a low, rolling snort, sharp, accusatory. His ears flattened, his muscles tensed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Edward took a step back, unsettled. "It's just a beast," he muttered. But Silas was not finished. He turned and walked toward the doorway, then back to Edward, stamping his hoof hard against the floor. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then he wheeled sharply toward the open street, neighing so loudly it rattled the windows. The meaning was unmistakable: follow me. See for yourselves. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He's leading us, Dawson said. Just like he led the ranch hands. Edward paled. This is madness. You'd follow a dumb animal into the desert? But the crowd had already shifted. Curiosity, anger, and the undeniable sense of justice pressed them forward. Within minutes, lanterns were lit, horses saddled, and a group rode out of town, Silas at the lead, the sheriff and his deputies close behind, the townsfolk trailing. Edward had no choice but to go with them, dragged along in the sheriff's custody. Night spread over the desert like a black cloth. Silas moved with confidence, retracing the path he had taken before. The group followed in tense silence, lanterns swinging, hoofs crunching over gravel. At last, they reached the mesquite tree. The chain still lay coiled in the dirt, padlock glinting under lantern light. The sand bore the deep grooves of wagon wheels, half erased by Edward's attempt to cover his trail. But no covering could erase everything. The horse pawed the ground beside the lock, snorted, then stared directly at Edward. The sheriff bent to examine the iron. His hands traced the stamped letters on each link, E.H. and Company. The initials were plain as day. The crowd erupted, shouts of fury, cries of disbelief. The evidence was undeniable: Edward had used his own foundry's chain to bind his daughter. His wealth had betrayed him. You would chain your own blood, the sheriff said, rising to his full height, his face hard as stone. The law doesn't bend for men like you, Holloway. Not anymore. Edward sputtered, reaching for words, but none came. For the first time in his life, he found himself stripped of power. Money could not silence a child's voice, nor erase the witness of a horse, nor sway a town united by outrage. Silas reared suddenly, striking the air with his hooves, his cry splitting the night like a trumpet of judgment. Sparks flew as his hooves struck the ground near the chain, as though demanding the world to see. The twist was complete. Edward Holloway, who had thought himself master of all, was undone not by rivals or courts, but by the loyalty of a white horse that refused to forget what it had seen. Back in town, the courthouse filled to bursting. News spread quickly across the county. Papers printed the story within days: Millionaire brought low by daughter's chains. Some refused to believe, but most saw it for what it was: truth too stark to deny. At the trial, the evidence was laid bare. The chain. The padlock. Clara's testimony. And always, in the background, Silas stood tethered outside the courthouse, a living reminder that no one, no matter how rich, could hide cruelty forever. Edward tried to argue, tried to buy, tried to intimidate. But the more he struggled, the more the town turned against him. His empire of fear crumbled like sand under a storm. Clara, though frail, found her voice in those days. She sat before the jury, her small hands folded, and said with quiet courage, "I thought no one would ever come. But Silas came. He never gave up on me. And because of him, I am here today." The jury deliberated less than an hour. Edward Holloway was found guilty of abuse, of cruelty, of neglect. His properties were seized, his influence stripped, his reputation shattered. He left the courthouse not as a man of power, but as a prisoner led away in shackles not unlike those he had placed on his child. And in the square outside, Silas stood proudly, the crowd pressing around him. Children touched his mane with awe. Mothers whispered prayers of thanks. The white horse had become more than a witness, he had become a symbol of loyalty, courage, and truth. For Clara, the ordeal was not erased overnight. The scars on her wrists remained, faint but permanent, reminders of both cruelty and survival. Yet she no longer carried her burden alone. The town rallied around her, offering shelter, food, and kindness. Mrs. Hanley, the housekeeper who had once been too afraid to speak, took her in as her own. Every evening, Clara returned to the stables where Solace was kept. She would rest her cheek against his neck, just as she always had, and whisper, "You saved me." And though Solace could not speak, he would breathe steady and warm, as if saying, "I only did what love commands." The truth had been revealed, the chains broken, not only of iron, but of silence. And Edward Holloway, once the richest man in Clearwater, became the poorest of all, a man with no love, no trust, and no freedom. Morning light spilled across Clearwater's courthouse square. Where once people had glanced nervously at Edward Holloway's black carriage, they now gathered freely, voices alive with relief. A sense of balance had returned to the town, as if a long shadow had finally lifted. Inside her borrowed bedroom at Mrs. Hanley's cottage, Clara stirred beneath a quilt hand-stitched by neighbors. The scent of warm bread drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint tang of desert air. She opened her eyes slowly, and for a moment, the memory of the chain still clung to her like a phantom weight. But then she heard it, the steady sound of hooves in the yard, pacing softly. Solace. She rose, still weak but steadier than she had been in days, and shuffled barefoot to the porch. There he stood, white coat glowing in the sunrise, mane tousled by a gentle breeze. His eyes found hers instantly, dark and deep as ever. "You never left me," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. She pressed her cheek against his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and earth. Her thin arms wrapped around him, and for the first time since the desert, her heart felt safe again. The town decided it would not forget. Weeks later, on a bright spring afternoon, the square was filled with people once more, not for trial, not for whispers of scandal, but for celebration. A wooden platform had been raised, draped in banners. At its center stood Clara, her wrists now healed, her eyes brighter, her small hand resting proudly on Solace's neck. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This town has lived too long under silence," he said. "But silence breaks when courage speaks." A child spoke. And when her voice faltered, a horse carried the truth for her. Justice is not always swift, nor is it always loud. But when it comes with the strength of what is right. Applause thundered through the square. Clara blushed, leaning close to Solace. The stallion stood steady, calm in the presence of so many, as if he understood the honor being given. Then, with solemn ceremony, the mayor unveiled a bronze plaque affixed to the courthouse wall. It bore a simple inscription. "In memory of truth witnessed, loyalty unbroken, and courage shared." To Solace, the horse who carried justice, and to Clara, the child who endured. The crowd cheered. Children ran forward to touch the plaque. Mothers wiped tears. Old men removed their hats. Edward Holloway did not see it. He sat miles away in a county prison, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, alone with the echo of his own arrogance. But perhaps, in the silence of his cell, he remembered the sound of iron chains snapping in the night, not by his hand, but by the will of justice. Life did not return to what it had been for Clara. It became something new, something brighter. Mrs. Hanley treated her not as a servant's burden, but as a daughter. The town's schoolteacher gave her books, encouraging her curious mind. Neighbors left baskets of food and fabric, each gift a stitch in the fabric of her healing. But her greatest comfort remained Solace. Every morning she rose early, before lessons, to groom his coat until it shone. Every evening, she walked him to the edge of the paddock, where the desert stretched endlessly, and whispered secrets into his ear. "You showed them, Solace," she often said. "You made them see." The horse would nuzzle her shoulder in reply, patient and gentle, as if assuring her he would always be near. One summer evening, Clara sat on the porch with Sheriff Dawson, the sunset painting the sky in amber and rose. He had come to check on her, as he often did. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you understand what you've done?" She looked down at her hands, still faintly scarred. "I just stayed alive." "No," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "You showed us what kind of men we've let walk free too long. You gave this town back its voice. And that horse of yours," he paused, smiling faintly. "He reminded us that loyalty doesn't lie." Clara leaned against the porch post, gazing at Solace grazing in the fading light. "He's more than a horse," she whispered. "He's family." The sheriff nodded. "Family ain't always blood, Clara. Sometimes it's who stays when no one else does." Those words stayed with her. Years later, people would still tell the story. Parents would warn their children not of monsters in the dark, but of pride and cruelty that were the face of wealth. And always, at the heart of the tale, was the white horse who would not let the truth be buried. Children in Clearwater grew up believing that loyalty had a face, that of Solace, the stallion whose hooves carried justice through the desert night. And Clara grew up knowing that her survival was not just her own strength, but the love of a companion who never abandoned her. On the anniversary of her rescue, Clara stood once more at the mesquite tree. The chain was gone, the scars of iron weathered away by sun and time. Flowers grew there now, wild desert blooms planted by the townsfolk. Solace grazed nearby, his coat still shining like moonlight, though age had begun to silver the edges of his mane. Clara knelt, resting her hand against the bark where once her body had trembled. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I forgive, but I don't forget. And because of you, I'll never be afraid to speak again." Solace lifted his head, watching her, the eternal witness. Closing reflection. Cruelty believes it can hide in silence, but silence is never permanent. Love and loyalty have a way of breaking through, even when spoken only in the steady heartbeat of a horse, or the trembling words of a child. Edward Holloway learned too late that wealth cannot chain truth. The chains he forged became his own prison. And Clara learned that even in the darkest desert, hope can arrive on four hooves and a loyal heart. Because justice is not always loud, not always swift. Sometimes, it comes quietly, on the back of a white horse, under the stars, carrying nothing more powerful than loyalty and love. No chain is strong enough to bind the truth, for loyalty will always find a way to break it free.